Good evening. And thank you everyone for coming out tonight for a wonderful presentation for an even more important cause. So before we get started, before I introduce myself, I want us all to kind of turn our heads to the back. Some of you saw the choir that was up here of some of our Ukrainian citizens, and I want you to say the following: Yakuyu, Yakuyu, which means thank you to the Ukrainian families and the musicians. So ready? 1, 2, 3, Yakuyu. So as I said, we're glad to see everyone here tonight. My name is Jim Bensley. I'm the director of the International Affairs Forum at Northwestern Michigan College. And next to me is...
I am Amanda Rood. I am the executive director with the National Writers Series.
So we have partnered together to use our voice and our connections to assist those suffering the horrific aggression promulgated by one man. Tonight, you'll hear from a variety of speakers, some who will add context to the geopolitical ramifications of the war in Ukraine, others who are, or recently have been, immersed in the chaos and who will provide us with unique insight into the situation on the ground.
Tonight's event is not only informational, but more importantly, a chance for all of you to help ease the suffering through the work of the 4 different charities listed on your program. Thank you for taking time from your busy lives to help others whose lives have been so tragically upended during the last 48 days.
And now, let me introduce our first speakers. So bear with me, we're going to go through all 4 at one time. Dr. John Zachman is a professor in the Political Science and Philosophy Department at Northwestern Michigan College. John teaches moral and ethical philosophy and political science courses in a variety of disciplines and has been promoting student and community engagement in the world affairs for over the last 2 decades. John holds a BA from Michigan State University and an MA and PhD from Duke University. Dr. Tracy Bush is an associate professor of history at Ferris State University. She earned her BA from Vassar College in 1991 and a PhD from Georgetown University in Russian and European history. Since arriving at Ferris in 2006, Tracy has taught more than a dozen classes on a variety of U.S. and world topics. Apart from researching a book with the working title Roads to Communism from the Stalin Era to World War II, she has also been actively involved in promoting global awareness on the Ferris campus and beyond. In particular, she often gives historical context for current events in the Russian Federation. Major General Mike Leonard retired in 2010 from the Marine Corps after 37 years of service. From 2010 to 2012, he was the senior advisor to the Commissioner for Customs and Border Protection. He served until 2017 as the National Vice Chairman of Student Veterans of America and is currently a Woodrow Wilson Visiting Fellow lecturing at campuses across the country on leadership and ethics. In addition to his volunteer work on the International Affairs Forum Advisory Board and Executive Committee, he also serves as the chair of the Advisory Board for the Endangered Species Coalition, indulging his passion for the environment, and is vice chairman of the Veterans Advocacy Group, Northern Michigan for Veterans. And finally, Arwa Damon is a senior international correspondent based at CNN's Istanbul Bureau. As one of the network's Middle East Corps specialists, Damon frequently reports from conflict zones across the Middle East, North Africa, and now in Ukraine. She often focuses her work on humanitarian stories. In 2018, she won a prestigious George Foster Peabody Award for her reporting on the fall of ISIS in Iraq and Syria, and 3 Emmy Awards for her coverage in Iraq and Syria. She is a recipient of the 2014 International Women's Media Foundation Courage in Journalism Award, and in 2015 launched a nonprofit organization, represented here tonight, called the International Network for Aid, Relief, and Assistance, or INARA, based on her personal experience in war zones and war-torn nations. INARA focuses on building a network of logistical support and medical care to help children who have fallen through the cracks and need life-saving or life-altering medical treatment. Damon graduated with honors from Skidmore College in New York with a double major in French and biology and a minor in international affairs, and is fluent in Arabic, French, and Turkish. And now, let me hand the stage over to John and Tracy.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Amanda. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for coming out tonight. There's obviously a very serious reason that we're here, and it's very powerful to see people show up when human beings need to show up. So thanks for being here. I'm really pleased to have this discussion tonight with Dr. Tracy Bush from Ferris State University. We're going to try to provide a little geopolitical context for what's going on, some history of Russia, Ukraine, as well as some wider history of conflict within Europe that will set the stage for additional speakers tonight, and hopefully also help to kind of inform you as you think about where this conflict may go, what actions that we all can take, what actions are likely to be taken by leaders such as Putin and Biden and Schultz and others, and Zelensky. So with that said, we have a very tight time frame tonight because we have about 30 minutes to go through a whole lot, and I'm going to hand it off to you, Tracy, to give us some overview, starting, in the last 1,000 years, and then going, then digging a little deeper as we go into the post-Soviet era, and then leading up to, of course, 2014 and now 2022. So with that said, take it away.
Thank you. I see the mic is working. That is wonderful. Well, I have a few maps here for people who are in the larger audience, the virtual audience, so that we can, I think you'll see them too, so that we can get a sense of where Ukraine is. And I always like to say to my students, you have to understand the past, understand what's happening right now. So this for me is a dream, right? This is evidence, right? You have to understand the past. So the first map here shows, present-day Ukraine, and of course, tragically being attacked by its neighbor, by Russia. And I wanted to show you too this because this is the country that Putin says does not exist. So in order to understand history as it actually is, and not as politicians like to pretend it is, we have to travel back in time about 1,000 years or more. So the next map is important. Cue the next map. Okay, yes, here is a map of Kyiv and Rus. So for Russia to say that Ukraine doesn't exist is a rather incredible statement, since without Kyiv and Rus, there would be no Russia. This is where Russia begins, in Kyiv. And this empire, actually it's not exactly an empire, it was a collection of principalities, hard to see on this map, and it stretched from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, and it was a loose conglomeration. And these were very much, these principalities were very wealthy because they were at the crossroads of trade, both east and west and north and south. They traded with the Vikings. The name Rus actually is a Viking word. They traded with the Vikings. They were part of the river network that runs north and south. And eventually Russia would emerge out of this, and Moscow would be the head. Actually, Russia was known as Muscovy before it became Russia. And Moscow was not even one of the principalities to start with. It was a Johnny-come-lately. Can I have the next map, please? Okay. Basically, Moscow did not become a major city-state principality until after the Mongols conquered Russia, and they also conquered present-day Ukraine on the 1200s. So basically what happened was Moscow became the tax collector for the Mongols, and that's when it really became a powerful center. And then with Ivan the Terrible and the Tsars. Another thing to remember, to know about Russia too, is that the name Tsar comes from Caesar. So Russia sees itself as a successor to the Roman Empire. So that's where some of the grandiosity comes from. So the first Rome would be the Rome, of course, in the west. The second Rome would be Constantinople, which was the head of the Byzantine Empire. The Russians, or Kyiv and Rus, takes its religion and a lot of its culture from the Byzantine Empire, and then that same culture spreads as it goes north and east and becomes known as Muscovy later on. So that word Tsar is a very interesting one. And that's when Russia, I teach a class called Rise of the Russian Empire, and that's when Russia becomes an empire. So I thought it was very interesting when Putin says that Ukraine doesn't exist. And he shows this tiny little, space around Kyiv, like that's Ukraine. The rest of it are gifts given by Russia, gifts given by other places. But you can see here on the map how tiny Moscow is. That little yellow spot is where Muscovite territory was before 1462. And then it spreads, expands, and that's when it becomes an empire. Where is Ukraine in all of this? It's on the edge of the Russian Empire. It's actually caught between two major powers, Poland, where many of the refugees now are headed or are, and Russia. So those two major empires, and Ukraine's in the middle. And that's also important to think of in terms of where Ukraine is and has been at other points in history. For example, if you look back to World War I, when the Germans invade Russia, when Russia and Germany, of course, are at it with each other. But the Germans have some success. They move into the area of Ukraine and further even. It brings about the end of the Russian Empire, graveyard of empires, World War I. And there's that area. So the Ukrainian area is devastated by armies on the offensive, on the defensive. There's civilian casualties. Civilians are hurt terribly in this total war situation. The infrastructure is destroyed. The agriculture is destroyed. This happens again in World War II. So because it's right there on the invasion path, right, between Germany and Russia. So, and what happens between the two world wars? Well, it's called the interwar period. And the interwar period is when Stalin comes to power, 1928, and he starts his massive collectivization and industrialization campaign. And he puts a world of hurt on Ukraine in the process, because Ukraine is the breadbasket of Europe. That's where a lot of the wealth is, in this new Soviet state. Their wealth comes from Ukraine. I mean, we're going to see that, this coming year when Ukraine doesn't have its harvests, and how that's going to hurt. It's going to hurt the global economy, hurt food security. So that was true back then. It's still true today. And that was a terrible experience for the Ukrainians, because they were forced to collectivize their farms. And interestingly, that was what was promised to the peasants with the Bolshevik Revolution, was that they would finally have their own land. And that was taken away from them with collectivization. So between 1928 and 1932. So when you hear Putin talk about fascists and fascism, I mean, the fact that he's using this language, 100 years later, a little less than 100 years later, but still about that long. The Nazi phenomenon happened when the Germans invaded June 22nd, 1941. There were some collaborators in Ukraine because they hated what the Soviets did to them, and they hoped that the Germans would have a better system. Of course, they didn't, because if you know your World War II history, and I know a lot of people are World War II buffs, the Holocaust begins in Ukraine. So not only do they suffer mass starvation due to collectivization, between 3 and 7 million people die, but then again, they're hit again even later by the Holocaust, when that again Operation Barbarossa starts. So you've heard of Babi Yar, right? That's been in the news. There's firing on the Babi Yar Memorial by the Russian forces. So 30,000 Jews were killed. That's the first major mass killing of Jews in World War II, and that happened in Ukraine. So you can see just how much turmoil, how much tragedy Ukraine has borne. And so, of course, after World War II, they were part of, again, the Soviet Union. And then with the collapse, I was in Russia a number of times. I was there in 1990, so the last gasp of the Soviet Union. I got to see Ukraine, not Ukraine then, but I saw Estonia, Lithuania, Estonia and Latvia. Lithuania, we couldn't go in because the tanks had just come in, so they thought it was too dangerous for American students to go there. So I did see Estonia, Latvia, and there was huge independence movements there. Just people were in the streets with their flags, their national flags. They remembered the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, where basically Stalin and Hitler divided Eastern Europe between the two of them. So they were ready to reclaim their freedom. And then 2 years later, I was back between college, undergraduate, and graduate school. And I went to Ukraine then, and I was researching the teaching of history in the schools. And when I went to Ukraine, they were so much further advanced than any of the other schools I visited, because there was a huge a huge expat community in Canada. They had the textbooks printed, Ukrainian history textbooks, printed, and they shipped them, like the moment the Soviet Union collapsed. So they had these textbooks in the classroom. So that's what I remember from early Ukraine. And then, the history, the more recent history that Dr. Zachman's bringing up in terms of, what happened after the collapse. I have another map that I think will help us visualize the way that was seen.
Tracy, while that pops up, let me go back just a little bit. Can I ask a question concerning the 1930s and Stalin? Because how did the ethnic composition of Ukraine change due to the Soviet regime? Because when we look at countries like Lithuania and Latvia and Estonia, my understanding would be that the Russian strategy there was to send ethnic Russians to these places to be able to manage the populations. Did we see the same thing in Ukraine? And if so, was it in the 30s, or when did that occur? And does that still have an effect today as we lead into the conflict as we're looking at it now?
That's absolutely true. There was, as I mentioned before, 3 to 7 million Ukrainians died. That wasn't the only place that there was death due to collectivization, but the majority of those deaths happened in Ukraine. And there's a word for it called Holodomor, which means death by hunger. And that's the Ukrainian communities in the US have made a huge effort to have that classified as a genocide. So yes, after the death of those millions of people, the Soviet Union, putatively, they were a non-ethnocentric regime. They weren't supposed to be about great power nationalism, but that does change under Stalin. And despite the fact that he is Georgian, he is a great Russian chauvinist, great Russian as in like Russia, the Russian Empire. Yes, he does move ethnic Russians into that space. And we see the divide, right, between Eastern and Western Ukraine. I mentioned it before as like a borderland between East and West. And that borderland is actually within Ukraine itself to some extent, because the Russian-speaking half tends to be more the East. But we see with also all the bombings that are happening, you can be a Russian speaker and you're still not going to support Putin after what he's done. So.
Thank you. Well, and so why should we look at the transition now, the 1990s? And well, here we have NATO expansion as well, which is going to largely occur under Clinton. But so why don't we return then to the transition from the Soviet period to the Russian period?
Right. The reason I have this here is because we hear also a lot of discussion, a lot of talk from Putin about NATO expansion. And I think he said at one point he wanted to go back to the 1997 lines. He wants to dial it back. So he wants NATO to disappear from what he considers to be his borders. So as NATO expanded during the 90s, as John mentioned, this was a period of time of reform for the Russians. I did a lot of work in Russia during those years. I worked for the federal government and facilitated partnerships between our US states and Russian oblasts. That's their word for state, oblast. And I didn't hear a whole lot negative about this expansion of NATO back then because everything was fairly friendly. But I did actually ask myself the question, like, why do we still have NATO when Russia's our friend? Like, I did have that question. But if you read the most recent article in Atlantic by Bill Clinton, he basically says it's an homage or a famage, I don't know, to Madeleine Albright. And he says, we did the right thing. See, the Russians came back. So yes, from Putin's perspective, I think it's always important to understand, not just from our American perspective, but also from the Russian perspective, why are they doing what they do? Like, what is their rationale? And so Putin's able to exploit the grievances that people have about the West gaining more power and influence in the world. And of course, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Russians were started to be seen as a minor power. So there's feelings of being betrayed by the West. And so why did NATO still expand? And so basically that red line for Putin would be Ukraine. So of course there was a number of events that happened, the Orange Revolution and then the Maidan Revolution in 2013, 2014, and then of course the annexation of Crimea. And I could say a few things about Crimea if you want, but that was a part of the Russian Empire that many czars and czarinas had fought many wars in order to gain access to Crimea. So when I was there in 2016, I was in Russia right after the election of Trump. I saw mugs everywhere that said Krym nash, so Crimea is ours. So for them, that was like their pushback at the West, that if you're going to keep pushing towards us, we're going to push back at you. We're not going to let you have Crimea. So again, if you didn't understand the way the Russians saw this as aggression, like we saw as peaceful expansion, we're spreading our, we're expanding freedom to anybody who wants it, they saw it as aggression. So two different ways to see the same thing.
Although it seems like from a Russian perspective, certainly the offer to join NATO was never given to Russia.
Right.
And so from a Russian perspective, this was a hemming in, or the experience for some in the Russian political elite would have been a hemming in. And which kind of brings us, I know from previous talks you've given that you perceive that from the Russian political elite, the threat of being hemmed in is a driving force in terms of some of their motivation here. That Ukraine is a key strategic territory, and that if that becomes a part of NATO, that is perceived as a threat. I think it is probably wise to also talk a little bit about Russian public opinion, because that's certainly relevant for us. I mean, I think many Americans are somewhat surprised at I guess the rallying around Putin that we certainly see amongst some Russians. So I'm interested in that. I'm also interested in certainly the experience since 1991 with the dissolution of the Soviet Union. The experience of your average everyday Russians has been a difficult one. And in my comparative politics class, for example, I teach about Russia, and this statistic is about 5 years old now, but I think it probably still pans out. And that the statistic that I give them is that the average wealth of the median Russian is actually a little bit less than the average wealth of the median Indian. And India, of course, is an incredibly large country and has been a democracy kind of against the odds for a long, long time now. But India has been very much a developing country, and it's been quite successful really over the last several decades. Russia, of course, had been one of the great superpowers, and so to think of the experience of so many Russians where their economic situation is really akin to that of many in the developing world, I think is something to keep in mind. So I've thrown a whole lot at you, and take it as you want. Russian public opinion, experience of threat, and this transition. I'm also very much interested, just to throw one more at you, I'm also very much interested in I remember the 90s, because like you, I was a student in the 90s. And I remember a certain hope about Russia, and that Russia was kind of democratizing. And under Yeltsin, it wasn't exactly a perfect process. Yeah. But it seemed like they had competitive elections, and it wasn't a foregone conclusion who was going to win. Yeltsin obviously was not democratic necessarily in a Western way. But it seemed to me that there was hope that it was going to move that way. And of course, now we're in very much an authoritarian Russia. So take whichever one you want first, and go ahead.
Well, since we started in the present, when we looked at Ukraine as it is today, I'll start with the present day today in regards to this too, because I think we all have that question, right? How could the Russians allow this? How could they believe what's happening? Like, we see what's happening, and I was so tortured by what was happening, what I saw, that this country that I have been, watching and studying for so many years would do something so terrible, when this same terrible thing had happened to them during World War II. That, this indiscriminate killing, we're even talking about, like, is this another genocide? Like, how can people be so blinded to what their country is doing? And I find this really discouraging. And I think from what I can tell, because I don't want to put my friends in jeopardy by talking to them, I don't know who's watching or reading their social media. I've heard that WhatsApp isn't as secure as we thought it was. But I do know that from talking to people who have come over, I have a friend who just came over to the US from Russia, they didn't really think it was going to happen. I mean, and we have I teach with a person who's from Russia at Ferris, and she didn't believe that it was going to happen. Remember, Putin had Ukraine circled before, right? And he stepped back. So just to do this is so irrational. I mean, with Crimea, it was very kind of focused. It had even some sense to it, it had logic to it. You know, that this was a rational, yes, we don't agree with his interpretation of history, but by the way the Russians see history, it made some sense. But this just made no sense at all. Like, why attack all of Ukraine? It didn't make sense. So we were all surprised. So I think, I mean, of course, this is a state-controlled media situation. It's a situation where you have an intelligentsia in the cities, educated people who have access to the internet, and they really know how to get around internet walls. They're very well educated. They have great math and science education. They know how to watch Game of Thrones, for example, without paying for it. I think we'd all like to know that secret. So they can figure out what's really going on in Ukraine, which is good. However, that's not the majority, and those who actually, we don't know how many there are. They think the statistics seem to show that about a third of Russians disagree with the war. That's a pretty high percentage. And about another third, they're in the rural areas, and they only have access to state-controlled TV and media. If you're urban and more educated, you have other forms of information. So you see an urban-rural divide, you know, as to who gets what information. And then you can see, can't you understand, too, that people would be so horrified to think that their country could do this, that they would grasp at straws to come up with any sort of idea of how this could not be true. So I think there's also a part of that going on.
Well, it also seems to me that when you're in a position where there's little that you can do, which my guess is that the experience of many Russians is that, what am I supposed to do anyway, even if I disagree with this, that psychologically that becomes more difficult to handle than if you resign to there being some logic to it. Mm-hmm. And I also have to wonder how a certain maybe experience of disrespect in the world community. I mean, again, to think of that context of being one of the world's superpowers, and then to think of what the last 30 years have meant for Russia is a perspective there in terms of domestically. And of course, the broader context there is that to think about how is this going to wash out over the next year or 2 years or even 4 weeks as we move forward. All of these are really important questions for us. We have 1 minute left, so I'm going to let you kind of offer any concluding remarks that you want to, and then we'll transition to the next segment.
Well, I do think that Putin has said it clearly. He said that the collapse of the Soviet Union was one of the greatest geopolitical tragedies, right, of the 20th century. So I think he's able to tap into Stephen Kotkin, who's a very well-respected scholar, wrote an article, and he talks about Putin's genius for tapping into the country's pathologies, right? And I think he taps also into, that sense of, the grievance politics that we see even in our own country. Grievance politics. I think, that somebody's to blame for what's happening to me, and that works. Unfortunately, that works, and he's able to use history, twist history, for his own ends. To his own ends. Always a dangerous thing. Always know your real history so you can't be manipulated by the politicians.
Well, in which also it's very important to think, what are the outcomes that Putin is looking for domestically? What are the outcomes he's looking for internationally? And then how do other world leaders and how do other citizens of the world act in relationship to that most effectively? Because at the end of the day, it's about effective action to counter such acts of aggression that ultimately make the difference. So thank you so much for sharing today. I'm being told that it's time for the next segment. So Tracy, thank you very much for a wonderful conversation.
Thank you so much.
You're very welcome. And with that said, the next segment, they'll start to bring down the screen. The next segment is Arwa Damon, the senior international correspondent from CNN, who's going to be reporting from Ukraine, and then Major General Michael Leonard, who is the vice chair of the IAF board. So we look forward to that. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Dr. Bush, and thank you, Dr. Zachman. We're joined now by Arwa Damon. Arwa Damon is a well-known CNN reporter who has been reporting on the situation in Ukraine. She's a friend of Traverse City. She's reported on the situation in Syria in the past. And Arwa, thank you for joining us tonight.
My pleasure. Thank you for the time and the platform.
Arwa, I believe you've been on the ground in Ukraine since early when the conflict began. Can you give us an idea of what you're seeing out there?
So I was mostly focused on the exodus that was taking place, with time spent both in Poland and on the Ukrainian side of the border. And it was quite stark to be seeing those images of people fleeing, the nature of what transpired that forced them to flee, that fear that is completely palpable, the way that you see this confluence of emotion in a mother's eyes as she's trying to hold on to her child, and especially something that was quite unique to Ukraine, and that is that everyone had to leave the men in their life behind. Men ages 18 to 65 were not permitted to leave the country. And I remember looking at these long lines of mostly women and children and just trying to imagine and think about what that final goodbye must have been to fathers, brothers, husbands, sons in some cases. But I also saw something that was quite heartening, and that is how once people had crossed over into neighboring countries, and using Poland as an example, they were greeted. Mountains of clothing, more volunteers at times than there actually were refugees coming across, volunteers offering anything from a hot cup of tea to hot soup to transportation, not just within Poland, but to other countries within Europe as well. And you really had this sense of unity, of response. And I felt my mind sort of taking what I was seeing in front of my eyes and superimposing what I had seen from other conflicts, from other war zones where people were forced to flee, where there was such a different response to their plight. And what I witnessed in Ukraine was so, and continues to be in terms of response and global unity, so beautiful to a certain degree. I would argue that it is perhaps, as far as I have witnessed, having covered war for nearly 20 years now, it is perhaps the best response that I have seen to any sort of a conflict. But of course, all that being said and done, I mean, what's happening inside Ukraine, as it is with many other similar war zones, I mean, the more the stories emerge, the more they make your hair stand on end, the more you start to question how it is that we continue to allow this to happen. We continue to do this to each other.
Yeah, Ara, you mentioned in the CNN interview or CNN report that you did earlier that the women and children, of course, are for the most part the ones traveling across the border. Can you describe their physical condition as they arrive?
They are exhausted. They are dealing with emotions that are, in many cases, novel, or at least the intensity of that emotion is novel. They're dealing with a level of fear that they have never known before. They are dealing with, and especially the mothers, with trying to explain this situation to their children. I mean, how do you explain to a child that daddy had to stay behind? And how do you explain to a child who has just seen their mother have to say goodbye to their father, bundling them up, waiting for hours? Children sense these things. They sense when their parents can't keep them safe. And in some cases, you see the children being brave because they sense that their parents need that from them. But then you also see these scenes of, little hands holding big ones, dragging them along because those tiny little feet are just so exhausted. it was bitterly cold for so long. The waits were often hours long just to be able to get across the border. And that sense of you're safe and the relief that comes with it of having made it to a neighboring country or made it directly out of the danger zone, that quickly becomes overcome by the ongoing, constant fear of those who you love, who you have left behind. And then for the vast majority of people who do make it across, let's remember nobody wants to leave their country. And when you do, even if it is to save your child, you still carry a lot of guilt with you. And so it's all these novel, almost impossible to actually put into words or describe emotions that all these people are carrying with them.
Yeah. Are you seeing, well, obviously, nobody leaves an illness behind. So we had individuals, of course, when the fighting started that already had pre-existing conditions. They're coming to the border. And I would imagine that there's others that have been injured as a consequence of either the fighting or the trek to get to the border.
Yeah, there are. We actually did this absolutely, I mean, at the same time gutting, but at the same time extraordinary piece on the first train. It was the first medical evacuation train that went from Poland into Ukraine. And this train was particularly focused on evacuating children who were in hospice in Ukraine, in Kyiv, which, has been under constant bombardment, has been largely destroyed. And these are children who can't walk on their own. Many who need constant medical attention. And their mothers had physically carried them for days because they had to get from Kharkiv to Lviv, closer to the border. And I remember one mother describing to me how she carried her daughter for 3 days. And that train to get her out of Kharkiv to Lviv was so packed. And we've all seen these images of the chaos that transpires, at these platforms inside these trains, that she couldn't put her daughter down. And when she managed to finally get into that medical evacuation train, she said that was the first time that she had put her daughter down in 3 days.
Right.
But Mike, what was beautiful about it was that her daughter didn't sense that she wasn't safe. Her daughter still had this extraordinarily beautiful smile. And I remember looking in that train carriage at all these mothers next to their sleeping children. And some of them had just passed out from exhaustion, mother and child together, just holding each other, or others who just lay there caressing their child's face. And there was so much love in that carriage. And now, of course, what so many organizations are trying to do is run more of these medical emergency evacuation trains, try to get access to those who are terminally ill, or it's everything that you could possibly imagine, right? It's babies who are born prematurely that are also in these areas under bombardment. It's, people who need to be on dialysis who are also in these areas under bombardment, where, electricity runs out, your generator cuts. What do you do? How do you actually handle this? And the more frightening thing is all of these stories that we're not actually hearing about yet. It's not just about people who are at risk directly because of the bombs that are falling. It's the people who are at risk because of the consequences of those bombs falling. The deaths that are going to occur because electricity cut out or generator fuel ran out. And so, yes, neighboring countries are starting to make preparations for this, big potential possible influx of wounded. But it's also very, very tricky to get someone out of the area where they've been injured and into some of these safer spaces.
Yeah. Arwa, I know you're not a medical professional, but you've covered combat for 20 years and you've seen the the aftermath of combat, particularly among the children. What should we expect in the psychological trauma that with these kids that have been uprooted from their homes, and in many cases, at least one of their parents, perhaps both of their parents, are now finding themselves in just an unbelievable situation?
You know, the trauma when it comes to these kinds of scenarios ends up being quite compounded, because you have the trauma that comes with the initial attack, right? Whether it's, a bomb that goes off or, whatever it is that happens, you have the trauma that comes with that initial violence. You have the trauma that comes with this idea of home no longer being safe. And that, to take that away from a child is incredibly destructive, especially if you can't rebuild it for them. You have the trauma of the journey of leaving the war zone. You have the trauma of watching and witnessing what it is that your parents are going through. And look, these mothers, these parents, whether it's Ukraine or any other war zone scenario, are extraordinary human beings, and they will do everything in their power to keep their child safe. But it is such a burden on them too, to try to shield their own fear, shield their own emotion, and still manage to get to safety without letting that panic, which is quite natural, rise to the surface. And children see this, they sense it, they know it. And on top of all of that, all of a sudden you're living either as an internally displaced person or as a refugee. And a lot of the things that, need to be addressed when it comes to mental health is, what is a normal reaction for a child that has gone through these multiple compounded traumas? Because there will be a reaction, and that's normal, and that's, to a certain degree healthy. And then what is the abnormal reaction to it? And a lot of kind of what one senses needs to transpire is focusing on trying to look, we're not going to remove the trauma. Right. And that's the tragedy of it. But what we can do is try to mitigate the consequences of it on the child. Because when you don't deal with this trauma, and I've seen it in children from Afghanistan, from Syria, from Iraq, from Yemen, what you end up seeing is that little spark of joy that a child is supposed to have in their eyes. You see that disappear. And there is very little that is more soul shattering than seeing a child who doesn't have a spark in their eye. But we shouldn't necessarily think that just because a child has lost that it can't be restored. It can be. And we've also seen it restored. But it does, yes, take a very concerted effort to be addressing the impact on children's mental health. Look, I've spoken to, friends and a number of people, who are adults now. They went through different wars in the past, and they're still dealing with the consequences of that, because back then they did not have the mental health support that they need. We live in a different era right now. We know the importance of mental health, and we know how critical it is that it be addressed, especially among children.
Arwa, when you were in Syria, you formed INARA, a 501c3 to take care of and address the injuries sustained by the children in Syria. I know now you've turned your focus to Ukraine. Can you tell us what INARA for Ukraine is doing at this time?
Yeah, so basically what INARA does, and the whole concept that it's predicated on, is trying to fill in the gaps when it comes to war-impacted children who are unable or are struggling to access the medical and mental health care that they need. And so what we do is we try to assess the situation. We kind of take a look at what everyone else is doing, and we try to see where we can fit ourselves in best to fill in a gap. And so when we looked at the Ukraine scenario, we recognize that we have, because of our still to date ongoing work with children from Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, a number of other war zones, unfortunately, we are in a position where we have a dearth of expertise when it comes to traumatic pediatric physical injury, but also mental injury. And so we have been looking at how we can take that expertise that we have specifically, because it's a very specific, issue when you're dealing with a child who has been traumatized because of war and violence, to other cases. And so we're looking at how we take all of this expertise that we have, our staff, and translate that into something that we can apply to the Ukraine context. And so basically what we're doing is we're building up programs, seminars, trainings for adults and who find themselves sort of on the front lines of the interactions with children. What do they need to look out for? How can they address certain situations? And we're talking about, teachers, volunteers, social workers will be providing back-end consultation for psychiatrists, mental health professionals who are on the ground. But what we're specifically doing within that, because other NGOs are also providing similar mental health support, is we're again going after the smaller organizations that don't necessarily have access to that larger working health group that emerges in this situation. And so to sum it up, we're very focused on pediatric mental health and taking our experiences, bringing it to the children of Ukraine and to the smaller organizations that are unable to access that. We're also looking again at these smaller organizations that are working with vulnerable children, trying to see what kind of support we can provide for them as well. And I would be remiss if I didn't say this, and I recognize that this is a conversation about Ukraine, but war impacts children in exactly the same way. And I think we need to recognize that this outpouring of support and kindness, of generosity for Ukraine is extraordinary. And we've proven to ourselves now what we're capable of. I think as we kind of look forward, we need to see how we take that to other conflicts as well.
I couldn't agree more. The children, regardless of their religion, their race, their ethnicity, are all injured by war. The concept that we see in movies with these clean, quote, air quotes, situations where the good guys and the bad guys fight, the good guys win, and everybody goes home. That's not the way it works. You know that better than anyone. And ultimately, the civilians who are impacted by this in every conflict zone, whether it's Syria, Afghanistan, now Ukraine, they all deserve our attention.
Absolutely, 100%.
Question for you on the refugees. You've talked to them. Let's suppose that Ukrainians who have been extraordinarily brave, they've been incredibly resilient, and that they can regain or retain their independence. Do you think most of the refugees will return home?
Yeah, I do. And, just to throw in there as well, I think if Syrian refugees felt like they could return home, they would.
Right.
I feel like if Afghans could return home, they would. I mean, if there's one theme that kind of echoes among a refugee population, it is, I want to go home.
Arwa, is there anything else that you'd like to add that is important, do you think, and that the audience ought to know?
I mean, look, this might be a bit divergent from this whole topic, but it's something that I've really been thinking about a lot. And I feel like we're at a stage where, at individuals, we need to start looking inside ourselves and asking this hard question of, why did I react to the image from conflict X, Ukraine? Why did I inside react to that differently than I did to, say, the images coming out of Syria or Afghanistan? And I think we need to begin to start to kind of unpack what we carry inside that we may not even be fully aware of, but that our emotions are going to show us when it comes to how we look at conflict Like what is happening inside Ukraine could not be more similar to what happened inside Syria.
Right.
It's Russia. It's bombing civilian neighborhoods. It's bombing schools. It's bombing hospitals. The images of people fleeing are the same in terms of the expressions on their faces. And yet the reaction to it could not be more different. And we really need to start asking ourselves why.
Yeah, I think you've brought up a very important point, Arwa, and I think for me and every single viewer here, we ought to be asking ourselves the question is does a child from one country count more than another? I don't believe they do. I believe they all count the same. They hurt the same way. They love the same way. They have the same needs. And we probably need to do a lot of soul searching in terms of just why this particular event, when it is so like Syria, has galvanized the world. And we need to ask, well, if Ukraine counts, why doesn't Syria count? Why doesn't Afghanistan count? They do count. Absolutely count.
The other thing also is, we know the money, look, the money that we need is there. It exists in the world. There is more than enough money in the world. The children of one conflict do not need to suffer at the expense of another. We see these spotlights shifting around from one conflict to another. And when the spotlight's on them, they're able to get funding. When the spotlight moves away, they continue to struggle. I mean, we have the means, we have the capabilities, and so we're lacking something. And we do need to look at ourselves, not just as a species, but we need to look at ourselves individually and ask, hard questions, and maybe come to terms with tough things like, okay, well, I didn't realize I was biased, but yes, you know what? I need to admit to myself that I inside felt more for the Ukrainian mother holding her blonde child than I did for the headscarf mother holding her dark-haired child. And why did I feel that way? And maybe, the next time I'm going to look at that, I won't feel that way. I mean, we can take, and it might be a bit early to talk about this, but we can take the reaction to Ukraine and do something bigger and better with it.
Right. We can turn it into a learning experience. Yeah. I'll just share with you, Arwa, that I'm recording this from Ireland, and the Irish have already taken in 17,000 refugees, and they're doing a remarkable job here of making them feel welcome. Arwa, I want to thank you for taking the time to enlighten us, to tell us what is going on in Ukraine and on the border, for making us think a little bit more about ourselves. And I really appreciate what you've done here and what you will do in the future to enlighten us in your day job and when you come to Traverse City. And I hope one day that we can welcome you there.
My pleasure. A lot of the times when people say, how can they help? For everyone who's tuning in to this, time is one of the most important things that we have to give. And so I just appreciate you and everything that you're all doing and everyone who has joined us.
Well, you're welcome, Arwa. Back to you, Jim.
So thank you, Mike. Thank you, Arwa. Thank you, Tracy. Thank you, John. I think that was an inspiring look into a little bit of the geopolitical and some of the humanitarian aspects of what's going on. And now we're going to take a short 10-minute intermission. So please feel free to go out into the lobby, check out the charities that we have there. There's a little QR code. You'll be able to run your phone across that and donate if you so desire. And there's one thing that I do want to say. This is some great news, and that is that we have recently been informed that the Traverse City Noon Rotary Club has agreed to match up to $5,500 tonight only. So keep that in mind when considering a contribution. Yes, thank you, Noon Rotary. And tonight, Rotary is considering Bethany Christian Services as an earmark for their contribution. But please know that any donation to one or to multiple charities will go towards the match total. So thank you again. And thank you, Chris Steffenschuh, for your music, which you're also going to provide during the intermission. So please get up and stretch, and we'll see you in 10 minutes when we have on stage Benjamin Bush, Doug Stanton, and Ulana Suprun.
All right, welcome back. Thank you. The second half of the program is with Benjamin Bush, Dr. Ulana Suprun, and moderated by award-winning author Doug Stanton. This will focus on current humanitarian efforts in Ukraine. So please allow me to introduce our esteemed guests. Benjamin Bush is a writer, filmmaker, and illustrator. Following a studio art degree from Vassar College, he served 16 years as a Marine Corps infantry and light armored reconnaissance officer, deploying twice to Iraq, where he was awarded the Bronze Star for Valor and the Purple Heart. He played Officer Colicchio for 3 seasons on the HBO series The Wire and Major Eklof on the HBO miniseries Generation Kill. He's the writer-director of the films Sympathetic Details and Bright, and has been involved as an actor, writer, or producer on over 30 films and television projects. He's also the author of the memoir Dust to Dust, and his essays have been published in Harper's, the New York Times Magazine, Guernica, NPR, Best American Travel Writing, and numerous literary journals. Winner of the James Dickey Prize and 5-time nominee for the Pushcart Prize, his poetry has appeared in North American Review, Prairie Schooner, 5 Points, Epiphany, and Nimrod, among others. We're very thankful that he took time out of his busy schedule to be here. Doug Stanton is a #1 New York Times bestselling author whose writing has appeared in the New York Times Book Review, Washington Post, Time, Newsweek, and Esquire, where he's been a contributing editor. He received an MFA from the Writers' Workshop at the University of Iowa, graduating with coursework in fiction and poetry workshops. His award-winning books have been named New York Times, Publishers Weekly, and Amazon Notable Best Books. His book, Horse Shoulders, was the basis for the Chris Hemsworth movie, 12 Strong. Great movie if you haven't seen it. Dr. Suprun is a Ukrainian-American from Detroit, Michigan. She received a BS in biology from Wayne State University and was awarded her MD from Michigan State University College of Human Medicine in 1989. In November 2013, Dr. Suprun and her husband Marco moved to Kyiv. In her capacity as Director of Humanitarian Initiatives of the Ukrainian World Congress, she founded the NGO Patriot Defense, an organization that provides tactical medical training. In early July 2016, Ukrainian Prime Minister Vladimir Grossman offered Dr. Suprun the position of First Deputy Minister of Health of Ukraine. Her nomination was publicly supported by President Petro Poroshenko and approved by the Ukraine Cabinet of Ministers. And a few days later, she was appointed Acting Minister of Health. She also founded the NGO ARC-UA, which publishes books and an online journal in both Ukrainian and English languages, with the mission to tell the stories about Ukrainians, who they are, and where they can be. Dr. Suprun and Marco Suprun have created the initiative CESU Rescue, a coordinating center that provides life-saving equipment to the state emergency services of Ukraine, and also founded Foundation Ukraine, one of our featured charities this evening. Please welcome Doug, Ben, and live from Kyiv, Dr. Suprun.
Good evening, everyone. How are you? Dr. Suprun, can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Let's all big round of applause that she can hear. Thank you. Yes, we are here. There is a slight lag, as you'll notice, but we can see you great, and we're looking at your bookshelf as we've all become accustomed to do for the last year. We see that you're a George Martin fan. That's great.
Yes, we are.
Wow. My friend Benjamin Bush is here as well, Dr. Suprun. For those of you who don't know, Ben is former board member of NWS. And Ben, you've just returned from Ukraine, and we want to talk about that in just a moment. But first, Dr. Suprun, we'd like to start with you. It's 2 o'clock in the morning where you're at right now in Ukraine. If you were to walk outside and look around, what would you see right now?
First of all, I want to thank you for having me. It's 2:30 in the morning, or 2:51, as it's a little bit later than 2:30, and I can't walk outside because there's a curfew, and civilians are not allowed outside onto the streets between 9 p.m. and 6 a.m. in the morning. What I would see, or I can see out my window, we have blinds up so that we have blackouts on our windows. But what I would see is completely darkened streets with no people on them. I would see block posts or checkpoints every few hundred yards because we live relatively close to where the government, most of the government institutions are, and there's quite a bit of military presence here. However, what I don't hear and I don't see as much as I had been are air raid sirens, and I don't hear the explosions anymore, because in the last week, around last Thursday, the Ukrainian military was able to liberate quite a bit of territory around Kyiv and Kyiv Oblast, and the Russian military has now gone back into Belarus, and they are going, from what we're being told, is that they're going to be concentrating more in the east and the south. So for us in Kyiv, it's gotten a little bit quieter and a little bit safer, and some people are starting to return as well. I also heard that some of the embassies are starting to come back, which is a very hopeful sign. And we had some very special guests today visiting our president. The presidents of Poland, Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia were all together with President Zelensky here in Kyiv to show their support. We really do see and feel and hear the support from all of the world. The speakers who spoke before us, before I'm speaking, what they're saying, the amount of outpouring of support, of help, aid, humanitarian aid is really overwhelming. And the Ukrainian people are very grateful for it. We do appreciate everything that the world is doing for us.
Well, thank you for that. And I know if you could see us, we're all gathered in this room, a packed room, wanting to know. Well, you and I talked yesterday just for a moment, and I said, it was a rhetorical question, why should we care? And it was a rhetorical question. I know that answer. But you gave an astonishing answer to me because you know Traverse City. Do you remember what you said to me in that answer? You know this area well.
Yeah. Yes, I know Traverse City quite well. I was born in Michigan, and we used to travel to Traverse City for vacation with my family when I was growing up. And my brother's sister-in-law and her husband are actually live in Traverse City. It's Vera and Brian Fisher. So I visited Traverse City quite a number of times, including my brother has a condominium there at the golf resort. So what I can do perhaps is give you an example of somebody who's been to your city and compare it to something that's going on here in Ukraine. Well, Traverse City has a population of about 15,500 people. That's the same population of a city called Borodyanka. It's one of the cities that you've seen that has been completely destroyed. So imagine that you're sitting at home, and on February 24th, you wake up in the morning, and all of a sudden there's explosions, there's air raid sirens, and the next day a foreign army rolls into your town in tanks, takes over your town, and you're under occupation for a full month. When they finally leave, what you find is devastation. 50% of the buildings are destroyed. People's homes are destroyed. Half the people have left your town. There's hundreds of people that are dead, lying in mass graves. And this is something that could happen in a European country in the 21st century. It's a horrific, horrific thing. And what's really scary about it is that it couldn't be stopped. And I think that's something that we need to learn the most about. Listening to the first speakers, I noticed that much of what was talked about was being told from the Russian point of view. Why did Russia invade? What is Russia going to do? What is with the Russian people? And why do they care or do they not care? Well, I think that maybe we should refocus and look at the Ukrainian people. Yes, there are refugees. And yes, there are the women and children that have left. But what we want to do is we want to rebuild Ukraine so that those women and children can come back. Half of the children of Ukraine have left as refugees or are displaced. That's 12 million people, of which 6 million are children. And we need to bring them back, and we need to bring them back safely. And that's one of the functions of our state emergency services of Ukraine, or the SESU. What they do is they're firefighters, they're rescuers, but they also take care of demining. Right now, the biggest amount of work they have is demining the recently liberated areas in Ukraine, whether it's in Kyiv or in the Kherson region or in the Sumy region or in the Kharkiv region, because there's been quite a bit of territory that has been liberated. And just to give you some idea of the amount of work we're talking about, they have estimated that 300,000 square kilometers need to be demined. That's the size of the state of Arizona. That's half the territory of Ukraine. And the state emergency services, although they have 70,000 firefighters and rescuers, only 564 of them are actually pyrotechnic specialists that can work on demining. We need the help for those firefighters who are responding to every one of the explosions, every one of the fires. We need help for the rescuers who are coming in and trying to rescue the people from the debris after the bombings have happened. We need the volunteers that come and bring food and water to the refugees, to the evacuees, and to those who've experienced the bombings and have had injuries. And what we need to do is help them so that they can do their jobs, so that those refugees that were talked about earlier, that had that fear in their eyes, the psychological effect that it's having on the children will be lessened once they're able to come home.
Thank you for that. You've given us a very broad frame, and you have applause in the audience as well. I do want to remind all of us sitting here, this is a fundraiser. We have Bethany Services in the lobby, Save the Children, INARA, and of course, Dr. Suprun's own foundation, Foundation Ukraine. Ben, do you want to ask a question? You've returned recently from there, and you were chronicled in an article in Esquire magazine and on Anderson Cooper CNN, none of which was intentional on your part. You didn't go there for any kind of coverage. What would you ask Dr. Suprun right now?
Doctor, thank you so much for joining us. And my biggest question, because I was in Lviv, which is a kind of a pivotal city for both refugees leaving and, of course, supplies coming in from both Slovakia and Poland. What has been the most effective pathway for donations to get to you directly? Is there now a system in place through the infrastructure in Ukraine and the volunteers that gets you critical supplies that you'd like to tell all of us about? Is there a conduit for that at this point? And is there a critical supply that, no matter how much is pouring into Ukraine right now, is still lacking based on where you are and in the newly liberated cities, especially where we have so many injuries?
The supply chain has been organized quite well. There's been some delays because the Russians bombed the train tracks, and there's only one set of train tracks that can accommodate the trains that bring in most of the supplies back and forth. There are some trucks that travel on the highways, and now that the pathway has been cleared because the Ukrainian military has cleared out the Russian military from central Ukraine, it's much easier to get the supplies at least to the area of central Ukraine. Kharkiv, which is one of the cities that has been under attack from almost the very first day. Very many people, very many buildings have been bombed. A lot of people have been injured and have died. But there is a way into the city, and so that they're getting supplies. The biggest problem we have now is that there is no access to the city of Mariupol, which is on the Azov Sea. That city has been besieged, under siege, surrounded, and almost completely destroyed by the Russian military at this point. There's very little access there. It's very hard to get in and out. Even most recently, there were a couple of helicopters that went in to try to evacuate people, and one of them was shot down, and the people in the helicopter were taken prison. So it's those areas that are having the most difficult times. What's needed most, and this is something that is perhaps not quite what you would expect, but today, President Zelensky said something that just very resonated with me, and it's that freedom should be armed better than tyranny. And at this point, Ukraine is not armed better than tyranny. So what is needed is more support from the American public to put pressure on their government, on your government, to send those weapons that are needed to keep Ukrainians safe in the cities. Those are air and missile defense systems. This isn't anything that is offensive weapons, it's defensive weapons. It's also sending fighter jets because Ukraine's skies are open, and the city of Borodyanka that was almost completely destroyed was destroyed by airstrikes. The city of Mariupol that's almost destroyed was destroyed by airstrikes, and Ukraine doesn't have a very strong air force. Asking the government, your government, to be supportive of Ukraine in those specific areas. Nobody is asking for boots on the ground, and we don't expect someone else to fight our fight for us. We'll fight it ourselves, but we need to be armed properly so that we at least have a fighting chance. And as you've seen, we've done a pretty good job so far. The Russians thought it'd be over in 3 days. Putin was going to have a parade on Khreshchatyk, which is the main street here, but he's not, because we've defended Ukraine. We've defended our capital, and with our President Zelensky, who's doing an excellent job, I think that everybody would agree that he's been, he may very well be, at this point, the leader of the free world from his stance on how he's defending Ukraine, defending freedom, defending liberty, defending those values that all of us grew up on. I went to school in the United States. I grew up there. I went to medical school. I treated patients. I know what all of you believe in, and that's what Ukrainians believe in. We believe in the same things, and we're just asking for you to help us so that we can defend ourselves.
Dr. Suprun, Ben, would you talk just for a moment? Because you spent 2 weeks training a civil defense force in Lviv, and you...
Yeah, and I got a call from Adrian Bonenberger, who's a friend of mine, a veteran and a writer, and he reached out to both he and to me and Matt Gallagher, who's another veteran and writer. And he married a Ukrainian journalist as an American journalist over in Ukraine years ago, and her parents were still in Kyiv. So their mission was to extract the reluctant parents who are in their 70s, have never left Ukraine, and get them to America. And while they were there, the hope was that we could do some good, considering how many of these villages were becoming, surrounded, occupied, and there was no military solution available. The Ukrainian military was already stretched too thin, and the cities couldn't defend themselves. So the thinking was, of course, that we could train based on our knowledge of urban warfare and guerrilla tactics, expecting that there wouldn't be support beyond what they could find resident in their local communities. So for 2 weeks, we went to an abandoned area and used it as essentially a war zone and trained 50 to 60 just Ukrainian citizens outside of the military in how to kind of replicate themselves after we've left. We were trying to train future trainers. And we'd already seen what the Russians had done. And we'd seen what had been effective despite being outclassed in terms of available technology and weaponry. So that was our mission, and that's where we spent our time for those 2 weeks. And they were just, 23-year-old IT recruiters, lawyers, welders, construction workers. And I mean, it was an amazing experience to see people so singularly focused on defending their home when a war was already living in their country. And they could never expect that it wouldn't come any closer. There was no sign at the time that Russia was going to back out. So we did it kind of in secret in an area in Lviv, which is a relatively safe city at the time to the far west. It wasn't until just about before we left that they started hitting certain strategic targets there with cruise missiles. But every night, we'd gather in the stairway because of the air raids. You just never knew. And considering the damage that Russia was doing at the time, anything was unpredictable. So that was our mission at the time.
So you're really echoing Dr. Suprun's, you were impressed by, we look out in the audience here and we all kind of wonder, what would we do? Would we be able to pick up a gun and learn how to run across the field?
And every day, that's interesting Dr. Suprun would say that, because at the end of every training day, I would look out at our trainees who were, riveted on trying to figure out how to negotiate a war as just regular citizens. And I would say, okay, when you go home to your apartments, to your homes, fight your way back. Treat your city as a castle. Every single alley, every single sidewalk, every single back entrance. Imagine if you had to defend it and retrograde. Imagine if you had to buy time for your families to get out. Imagine walking down your street in a completely different way. And it's kind of like what the doctor just said about Traverse City. Imagine what it was like. But they actually went home and kind of diagrammed their own neighborhoods as if they had to fight their neighborhood, as if vehicles were rolling down, troops were moving through. And I mean, it's an astonishing feeling, and to allow your imagination to do that. If you go home tonight, you don't have that concern. It's unlikely anyone here will ever have to worry about that. I fought my way through Ramadi, so I know both sides of occupation and combat and defense. And that was what we tried to give to them, was the knowledge of turning every building into a fortress and being willing to give them up to buy yourself time.
Given that, Dr. Suprun, what can we do sitting here? Well, first of all, I want to stop. Is that your lived experience when you go home? I mean, how do you now see your city differently? Put us in your shoes as you go about your daily life now for the past 6 weeks.
I had either the fortune or misfortune, I don't know what to call it, because it prepared me for this. We lived about 10 blocks away from the World Trade Center, and we were there on September 11th when America was attacked. Our neighborhood had been closed down for about 7 or 8 months while the rest of New York returned to normal, because they were still cleaning the debris. They were still putting out fires. Firemen were working and the rescue workers were working for a very long time there. So I had a little bit more experience with something similar to what was happening here, because we have felt that attack. What is it like here? It is very similar to what was already described. You're very cognizant of who's walking around you. You're very careful about when you open the door and you walk in or you walk out. If you have cameras, like we have a camera that points out to our front door. Before we walk out, we check to make sure that there's nobody lurking about. You have to Be very patient because there are a lot of checkpoints and there's a lot of military around, a lot of territorial defense and police and National Guard, and they will ask you for identification and they will check your bag and they will make sure that you're not carrying anything. All of those things are much more, takes a lot longer to get something done. The stores are starting to open now, but for a while there were no stores open at all. We had stocked up, so we had enough food, enough water. We had a generator. We had everything that we needed in case we would lose electricity and in case this was going to be a longer period of time that we would be in Kyiv without access to any supplies. But a lot of people didn't have that. And one of the things I did notice was once the pharmacies opened, there were long lines of mostly pensioners, of older people standing in line to buy their medicines because they only had a month's supply or a few weeks' supply and they had run out of the medicines already. So it's very different. It's quiet, but the kind of quiet that you feel sometimes when you're watching a horror film and you know that something might happen. And so you're constantly on edge. When we were training the military in 2014, we were told there's something that's called turning yourself on and turning yourself off. So as military personnel go into a conflict zone where there might be danger, they turn themselves on. And that means that you're at a very high level of attention. It's a very high stress level, and you're very aware of your surroundings. Once you leave that area, you can turn yourself off. And that's when your brain can clear itself out and you can relax and kind of get some rest and build up your strength for the next time. Well, all of us are turned on all the time. And that's very hard on both your physical system as well as on mental health and psychologically. So you will have greater outpouring of emotion when you see somebody you haven't seen in a while, or somebody comes back, from Lviv or from somewhere, some other city, and they returned, like our coworkers returned from other cities. When they came back, there's this huge outpouring of emotion that you wouldn't normally have if you just hadn't seen them for a couple of weeks. And all of those things can affect you quite a bit.
Tell us, in that regard, what Foundation Ukraine does.
So Foundation Ukraine, a little bit of a backstory. My husband and I have been here since the Revolution of Dignity, and we took part in that. And when the Russian military invaded Crimea and annexed it and then invaded eastern Ukraine, we wanted to help in some way. And through the Ukrainian World Congress, we created an organization that provided tactical medical training, combat lifesaver courses, first aid kits, long-range patrol medic courses, which are like combat medic courses, and trauma courses for physicians for the Ukrainian military and for the civilian hospitals that were taking in the Ukrainian military and civilian injured. That system of tactical medicine had not existed in the Ukrainian military because it was very similar to the Soviet system. It had not changed. Now the Ukrainian military has a much better system. They're better equipped, they're better trained, they have the medical equipment. I mean, we can still always give them more, but we saw that that was no longer something that was needed. What we did see was that there was the Russian military is deliberately targeting civilian infrastructure, whether it's residential buildings or hospitals or schools. We see that it's the state emergency services or the firemen and the first responders that are really having a tremendous amount of work that they normally wouldn't have. Just today, I had a meeting with them, and they said that they've had 16,000 events that they've responded to since the beginning of the war. That's about 325 a day, but it's not 325 a day all over the country. It's 2,000 in one city and maybe 50 in the city in, say, Lviv, where there's much less of a problem. They're doing a remarkable job, but unless you're a fireman, a firefighter, or a first responder, you may not realize that their uniforms don't last forever. They need to change them constantly. Their fire hoses break down. About 25 of their fire stations have been destroyed. Another 15 are under occupation. There's actually already been 29 of them killed in the line of duty, whether it's because of explosions, unexploded ordnance, or they were shot, or they died along in the line of duty. And just to give you a comparison, I looked up in Michigan how many firefighters die on average in a year, and it's on average 3. And in Ukraine, in 49 days, 29 firefighters and rescue workers have already lost their lives. They need personal protective equipment. They need uniforms. They need demining equipment. And one of the things that you've probably heard lately, and that in Mariupol, there's a suspicion that chemical weapons have already been used. And the State Emergency Service would be the ones responding to any kind of chemical attack on civilians. So they need the personal protective equipment and training for CBRN or chemical, radiological, biological, or nuclear events that may happen. All of these things are put together in a program that we're cooperating with the state emergency services. We're finding the proper trainers, we're finding the equipment, and then we're also finding communities that want to donate used equipment, say fire trucks or hoses or other things that they may be able to donate. As I said, right now, the largest amount of work they have in the liberated areas is demining and also cleaning up the debris so that rebuilding can be done or people can come back to their homes. The people in Borodyanka, in this town that's the same size as Traverse City, are told that they can't come home until the end of May. And that's because that's how much demining has to be done. The Russians have actually booby-trapped people's front doors to their houses. When they open their washing machine, it explodes, or their refrigerators. They even booby-trapped and mined their own dead soldiers so that when the Ukrainians came to clear the bodies out, explosions happened. So civilians aren't being allowed in any of these areas, and it's the state emergency services that are creating a safe environment so that our families that have unfortunately been displaced will be able to return home and rebuild.
Thank you for that. I just want to remind everyone in the lobby that that is Foundation Ukraine. There is a table for that, for INARA as well, for Bethany Services, and for Save the Children. And that's why we're here tonight. It sounds to me like every dollar I put into what you've just discovered would go right to addressing those challenges, which are astounding. Ben,
yes,
go
what's
ahead.
really great about it is that we work directly with the state emergency services of Ukraine. So they give us what their needs are. We find it, buy the equipment, and give it right to them. So there isn't a lot of middleman involved, because sometimes if you don't know what they need, or if you're collecting things that you think they need rather than getting a list from them, you may bring in equipment that's not necessary. And they're telling us right now, specifically at this moment, what it is that they're needing to make the liberated areas safe for the Ukrainian families coming home.
We need to wrap up in just a bit, but as the doctor was talking, you're nodding your head, Ben. Well,
Yeah, I mean, I just came from a small town of Reed City with checks from Tim and Terry Bezette and Mary Murnick, kind of pillars of our community. And they're very generously supporting this, so I'm glad to know exactly where it will go, because it's so difficult to know in such a wide span of a disaster like this, where we can directly support you in a critical need. So I'm grateful that you're actually coordinating it there. I know it's got to be an incredible maze, considering how you have to work. But thank you for going there as a Michigander. And I wish we'd met up at some point, but you'll be always welcome home. And everyone here and everyone outside this room, thanks so much for supporting these efforts.
thank you. Dr. Suprun.
Slava Ukraini.
Thank you for being with us tonight.
Slava Ukraini, Heroyam Slava.
Yes. Good night, everyone. This ends our portion of the evening, and we will see you in the lobby afterwards.
Great.
Thank you, Doug. Thank you, Ben. And thank you, Dr. Suprun. Very interesting. So now we come to the final component of our evening, and that is a group that's working locally and over in Europe to try and do all they can to help those people that will be or are refugees from Ukraine and other areas of the world. Don't think because we mentioned Bethany Christian Services that it's only focused on Ukraine. It focuses on a lot of those people that are struggling and need a new place to live and to stay. So let me ask for a few of the representatives from Bethany Christian Services to join us here on the stage. And I'd like to call up first, Christy Gleason, Chelsea Hill, and Sandy Naskari-Devet from Bethany Services.
We made it up the stairs. We were a little nervous about that. Thanks, Jim. Hi, everyone. Wow, this has been a really amazing night. I don't know about you guys, but my heart is both full and breaking at the same time. My name is Christy Gleason. I am the Vice President of Adult and Family Refugee and Immigrant Services here at Bethany Christian Services. And Bethany, for those of you who don't know us, we are a 75-year-old organization, child welfare organization. Really, we walk alongside vulnerable kids and families, both here in the States and overseas. So we are in 36 states at over 100 locations within those 36 states. And then we have a presence in Eastern Europe, Central and South America, and Africa. And our programs really focus on those who need it the most. So we do adoption, we do foster care, we do safe families, which is coming along families to keep their kids out of the foster care system and close to them as possible. And we do that both here and overseas. It kind of depends on where you're at, what the programs look like. So I'm going to talk just a few minutes about what we are doing in Eastern Europe, and then I'll hand it over to our local team to talk a little bit about what our planned response is for here in Traverse City. So as the last few weeks, several weeks have been unfolding, we've been really trying to be very intentional about what our response is going to be in Eastern Europe. We have had a presence in Eastern Europe since the 90s, and so in Romania in the last couple of weeks, we have really upped our programming to focus on women and children coming in. We have opened a transitional shelter in Iași, which is up in the northern border of Romania and Moldova, serving women and children coming across. And you've heard today what they're experiencing. They are exhausted, they are tired, they are scared. And so our transitional shelter, which is a building of there's 6 rooms, but it's donated. It's been donated to us for use by a Romanian citizen who wants to help. And so our transitional shelter, there's rooms for eating, so there's fresh food, there's water, we're handing out hygiene kits, soap, deodorant, all the things that you forget to grab or you can't carry when you're fleeing. Mattresses, places to charge your cell phone, just things like really just hoping to give families a break and some respite as they continue on their journey. And then the other thing that we're doing that you heard a lot about today is focusing on mental health. So one of the things that Bethany does overseas is we train on psychological first aid. And that's really just very basic, simple tricks and techniques to help calm people down, calm your breathing, calm and reduce anxiety. And so we're training social workers and lay workers in Romania, in Albania, to really do psychological first aid with pretty much anybody they come across. It's a great tool to use. And so donations today and support today will go to help that training, will help supplies that we'll be handing over. And for right now, the work that we're doing in Eastern Europe is fully dependent on independent private donors. We don't have government grants right now for it. So all the donations that you've given to, not just to Bethany, but to the other organizations today, we say thank you, because the more you give, the more we can do. So we really appreciate it. It means a whole lot to us. But Bethany's also very, very involved in the work here in the U.S. with refugees, in Traverse City especially. So I will hand it over to Chelsea Hill, our director of our Bethany Traverse City branch, to talk about what we're doing in your backyard.
Thanks, Christy. So again, my name is Chelsea Hill, and I'm the branch director of Bethany Christian Services here in Traverse City. It's an honor to be standing here tonight as a community member who was born and raised in Traverse City. Even as a native, I had no idea of the Ukrainian community living around me. In fact, most people in our community do not know that there are around 700 Ukrainians living in our area. These individuals are local business owners, co-workers, neighbors, and friends. Since the 1970s, Bethany has been resettling Ukrainian refugees in northern Michigan. We've resettled 55 individuals since 2017, and most recently, a family of 4 who managed to escape the Ukraine days before the first invasion. What's unique about our program here in Traverse City is its family reunification in regards to resettling our Ukrainian population. So these are individuals who have family here in Traverse City waiting to welcome them here. As we wait to hear how the presidential determination will affect our local area, we are bracing ourselves for a potential influx. In fact, we had 300 individuals who were already in the refugee resettlement process. Some that were waiting for days, some months, some even years prior to this crisis starting. We hope to resettle and reunify these separated family members. We also hope to resettle other Ukrainian families who don't already have family here but are seeking safety in the U.S. And we feel that our city is a welcoming city, and we are very unique in our large Ukrainian population that already resides here. As these families resettle, they will face significant challenges, including culture shock and having to process through the trauma of war and fleeing their homes and often leaving loved ones behind, like we have heard tonight. English is rarely their first or even second language, but somehow they must find a way to apply for jobs, find housing, and even enroll their children in school. Bethany helps with these needs, but with the potential influx that we are expecting, we need our community's help now more than ever. This is where you come in. Are you a landlord, or do you know any landlords that can commit to affordable rentals to these families? Are you in a position yourself, your family, to host a Ukrainian family waiting for permanent housing, just short term until they can find something? Aside from housing, we need local businesses willing to employ refugees. Or could you help by donating financially so Bethany has extra funds to buy household needs such as bed, clothes, food, and diapers? Monetary donations is the most significant need right now and is crucial to the resettlement program's ability to continue resettling refugees. Please stop by our table in the lobby if you're able and willing to help. We would love to talk to you. We can't do it without you. And now I would like to introduce Sandy.
Well, good evening. My name is Sandy Mascari-Devitt, and I have the honor of being the remote refugee resettlement specialist here at Bethany Christian Services in Traverse City. I'm honored to be here tonight as both a new member of this community and as a proud member of the local Bethany team. It is with my pleasure to tell you a story tonight about a local Ukrainian family that I have been blessed to travel alongside as Bethany Christian Services works to resettle the newest family members that arrived here from Ukraine as refugees shortly before Russia's invasion. In the early years, back in Ukraine, Andre and his siblings witnessed as their father was arrested and jailed simply for being a Christian. 25 years ago, in 1997, newlyweds Andre and Victoria fled Ukraine as refugees. Along with Andre's parents and his 3 sisters, they fled the religious persecution that they had known in their homeland of Ukraine. Their ultimate destination was to be Traverse City, Michigan, a small northern Michigan community that was already well on its way to establishing a Ukrainian community, including Andre's 2 brothers who had come before. With hopes and dreams, the young couple forged ahead to create a new life where they could build a family, they could practice their religion without fear of persecution, and they could become hardworking, productive members of their new community. In 2001, Andre, along with his brothers and his father, worked hard to build a home for Andre's growing family. After a year and a half in 2002, Andre, Victoria, along with 4 of their young children, moved into their new home. In August of 2012, Andre and Victoria proudly became U.S. citizens. For 20 years, Andre and Victoria, Andre had worked hard for a local company as a mason. In September of 2017, Andre decided to start his own business, GVP Mason, and he hoped that this would one day become his family's future legacy. So over the course of time, their family had grown to a loving group with 7 children. They watched as their family continued to blossom. They were proud to watch their eldest daughter marry and start her own family. Then in 2018, they added to their family again, this time by bringing Victoria's mom, Helena, here from Ukraine as a refugee. Earlier this year, in February 2022, several weeks before the invasion of Russia into Ukraine, Andre and Victoria again opened their hearts and their home to Victoria's nephew, Dimitro, and his wife, Ola, and their 2 adorable children. I have been blessed to walk alongside this refugee family as we help them find their way in a new country with the same hopes and dreams that Andre and Victoria had those 25 years ago. Although there is joy in seeing this young family arrive safely in Traverse City, there's also sadness. Andre and Victoria and the rest of the family continue to pray every day for the family left behind in Ukraine. Between them, they have approximately 25 individuals that were already long awaiting in that pipeline. With your help, my hope is to see all of the local Ukrainian families reunited with their loved ones fleeing from the horrors brought from the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So with that, I give thanks to Andre and Victoria for allowing me to tell just a small part of their story. To Dimitro and Ola and their 2 precious children, thank you for allowing me to walk alongside you as you journey into this new adventure. But to the rest of you, this is a local issue, and it's my belief that together we can make a difference. Thank you.
Thank you, Christy, Sandy, and Chelsea. Thank you. What an evening, and how fortunate so many of us in this room and watching at home are today to witness these stories, these conversations, and be in a position where we can help in some way. I was always raised that no matter how little or how much you always have enough to give to someone else. And so we really encourage you, if you haven't already, to please consider making a donation to one of our 4 incredible charities. Again, those are Bethany Christian Services, Foundation Ukraine, INARA Ukraine Response, and Save the Children Ukraine. And if you had trouble, those of you that are here, with the QR codes, please know, and to those of you who are watching from home, you can donate directly on the IAF website at tciaf.com.
Thank you, Amanda. And thank you all for coming out tonight. It's been an important evening, an insightful evening, and hopefully one that will really inspire you to maybe ask more questions, maybe get to know one of our Ukrainian citizens, or support in some way. So please, as you make your way to the lobby, let me again thank all of you and those who helped bring this event to fruition. To our media sponsors, our sincerest thanks. To the Ukrainian musicians who were here earlier, I hope some of you did get to hear them, the choir. They were just beautiful voices. To Chris Stefanshu, who added some music in the interlude. To main content, to William Willingham and Cote. To Steve Baumgartner, who almost 6 weeks ago posed the following question to our IAF board: what can we do? And who has since given so much of his time to make this happen. To Doug and Ann Stanton, who didn't hesitate to say yes when a partnership was proposed, and have helped greatly with their expertise and professional contacts. To all our guest speakers, and to Alex Tank, IAF Production and Marketing, for his diligent and steadfast work during the day, in the evening, and on weekends, to dot the I's, cross the T's, and put the event together. Please join us in the lobby for additional information and a chance to meet the speakers. Thank you.